Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Hi, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery here once again. If you're looking for the China History Podcast, this is the place. We got that 5-part history of Chinese medicine series out of the way. I'm probably back from London by the time you hear this, and, well, all the major media outlets have called the trip a smashing success. And now back to business. And for this time, I'm doing something I've never done before in a CHP episode, featuring a topic concerning the continent of Africa. Now, before I get into what Africa means to me and how this topic all came about, let me mention I'm a proud subscriber to Eric Olander and Cobus Van Statten's China Global South project. And since they started podcasting about China in Africa, around the same time I launched the CHP and Kaiser and Jeremy started Sinica, I have listened cover to cover to almost every one of their podcast episodes, and I subscribe to their newsletter as well. And if you're like me, and you're interested in what's going on in Africa and the Global South, this is a resource that is second to none. They've been my African gateway for years. Since at least middle school, when good old Mr. Lenway, my 7th grade social studies teacher, when he taught us about Africa and lectured about the story of Australopithecus and Olduvai Gorge and Tanzania, from way back then, the African continent became one of my 101 passions that I started developing at the beginning of my life. And even before I was 10, I had a big stamp collection, and I was one of those kids in the neighborhood or elementary school who could rattle off all the names of the countries in the world, their capital, and, if they had a prior name, I knew that too. And I vividly recall all these exotic self-adhesive foil stamps from Sierra Leone that further fueled my interest. In any TV documentary concerning anything about Africa, I never missed a single one. And pretty much all the way into my advanced age, I've always had this interest in Africa, and I've never been there. So this topic, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and China, let me explain how this whole thing came about. Way back in 1968 or 69, thereabouts, my preteen years, I checked out this book from the school library called Leaders of New Nations by Leonard Kenworthy and Irma Ferrari. It first came out in 1959, and I remember that the book was brand new, and I was the first one to check it out, so it was the new 1968 edition that I read. Leaders of New Nations. It was by no means a deceptive title. It introduced the leaders of all these former European colonies like Kenyatta, Senghor, Balewa, Nkrumah, Mohammed V, and Nasser as well. And also included in the new edition that I read was the story of the president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere. He's respectfully called Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. Mwalimu is a Swahili word that means teacher. So it was in that book, Leaders of New Nations, that found its way into my middle school library that I first read his name. And because of my early stamp collecting, I already knew of the colonial past of the United Republic of Tanzania and that it used to be called Tanganyika. So I was aware of Julius Nyerere from reading this book, and I read it with this pre-existing interest and awareness about Africa. And later on in the late 70s and early 80s, when I used to read all those old China Pictorial, Beijing Review, and other magazines, they always seemed to have some article about Tanzania. And even back then, I noticed they sure loved Nyerere in China. Julius Nyerere. And from the earliest times, Tanzania always seemed to be held up as the most model of friends as far as relations between Africa and the PRC went. I had one other minor Tanzanian nexus in my life when I studied Chinese political science at the University of Illinois under Professor Emeritus George T. Yu. He wrote a book that came out in 1970 that was very big in its day called China and Tanzania, A Study in Cooperation. And he was a respected scholar of China and Africa and Tanzania in particular. So he opened my eyes wider as to the importance of this aspect of China's global relations. And I actually contacted him last year. He's in his early 90s now. And more than 40 years after I took his classes, I wrote to him and, sort of reminded him who I was and encapsulated the entirety of my China career in a few sentences. And I told him about the China History podcast and how much I appreciated all he taught me. And he wrote me back, too. So with Dr. Yu's area of specialization of Tanzania in mind, I thought, let's focus on China, East Africa, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and the role Mwalimu Julius Nyerere played during this time as it related to China. Tanzania could serve as a microcosm for the much bigger picture that was going on in post-colonial Africa and all the liberation movements to rid the continent of the blight of colonialism and imperialism. I know most of you already know this, but for those who never looked closely at this nation of Tanzania before, it's located on the east coast of Africa, with Kenya to the northeast, sharing a coastline, and to the northwest is Uganda. Mozambique borders the south, and the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba are off the coast of Tanzania. Zanzibar is accessible by ferry from Dar es Salaam in under 2 hours. It's not that far off the coast. And bordering Tanzania to the northwest are Rwanda and Burundi, just below Uganda. And bordering Tanzania to the west and southwest are the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia and Malawi. 7 countries in all. You heard me mention more than a few times about the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He sailing his treasure fleets as far as the Swahili coast to ports in Kenya and Tanzania. Well, Swahili had served as a kind of lingua franca for that whole trading region that was once dominated by Persian, Arab, and Indian traders. Today, Swahili is Tanzania's national language, with English and Swahili being the official ones. Swahili is a Bantu-based language with heavy Arabic, Persian, and Portuguese influence. Over 60 million people live in Tanzania today, about 63% Christian, 34% Muslim. The country's famous for Mount Kilimanjaro, the Serengeti National Park, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria, and copious reserves of all the minerals and metals that all developed countries love. It ranks 121st in the FIFA men's ranking, 146th for the women's team. So let's quickly look at Julius Nyerere's bio and get a sense of post-World War I, World War II Africa. And we could use our perfect 2020 vision that we enjoy today in 2024 and look back on that time and perhaps gain a little context. That same old ideological struggle that goes on today to win the hearts and minds of the Lao Baixing of all African nations. Nothing new. As Lu Xun would have said about these kinds of things, old wine, new bottle. To refresh your memory, following the historic 19th century scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference, 1885, though the Belgians got there first, Germany had ruled Tanganyika since then. They had also cut a bunch of deals with local tribal chieftains, and as colonial masters, they did well for themselves. There was no picnic living under German colonial rule. But following Germany's defeat in World War I, they lost all their colonies. These were today's nations of Namibia, Togo, Ghana, Cameroon, and the jewel in their colonial crown, German East Africa. These included the nations of present-day Burundi, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And as we all read in high school, to prevent such a cataclysm as World War I from ever happening again, the League of Nations was established. And when they met, it was decided that all these former German colonies should be handed over to the victorious Allies. And these allies, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, were mandated to assist these former German colonies assigned to them and guide them along the yellow brick road to self-government and independence. German East Africa went to Great Britain. So did Ghana. South Africa got Namibia. Cameroon and Togo went to France. And maybe it was because of all that coveted mineral wealth beneath the ground. Maybe there were other reasons. But you can be sure in no time at all, the ones holding the mandate were carrying out a go-slow policy in the direction of self-government. And they were local residents of those nations who rose to the fore in the 1950s and articulated the aspirations of many African people who were wondering what was taking so long to obtain self-rule. So, Julius Nyerere was one of these men. Right man at the right time. Top-drawer communication skills, educated, good-looking, charismatic but not flashy, and a man of the people. He attended college in Kampala, Uganda, that had an association with the University of London. And there in Kampala, he was exposed to all the despised aspects of colonialism and the African liberation movement. And as we've seen in China, universities were often the incubators for young people to acquire passions for causes. In 1946, this 24-year-old son of a tribal chief, Nyerere received his diploma and returned home to Tanganyika. And following the end of World War II, Tanganyika went from being a mandate to a trust territory. And the British were signaling they were fine with the whole self-rule thing as soon as the Tanganyikans were ready. Nyerere was brought up as a Roman Catholic and taught at a mission school for a while. In 1949, he received a scholarship to attend the University of Edinburgh, the first Tanganyikan to be accorded this honor. And you can be sure he had plenty of opportunities to school himself on world events and political and economic ideologies. And there in Edinburgh, Julius Nyerere first learned about socialism and found this to be a wholly suitable system for Tanganyika. After receiving his master's in history, he returned to Tanganyika in 1952 and taught high school for a stretch until he decided to devote his energies full-time to the struggle for Tanganyikan independence. He joined a local social club that he converted into a political organization called the Tanganyika Africa National Union, or TANU. This was in July 1954. And he rolled up his sleeves and hit the road, traveling throughout the country and preaching the message of Tanganyikan self-determination and to urge the people to put nation over tribe and to unite to overthrow colonial rule. In 1955, Nyerere visited the U.S. and was able to get some face time with the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations. And there he was able to urge them to hurry up with the whole independence thing and getting Tanganyika admitted to the UN. The time had come. World War II had been over for a decade, and when he went back the following year in 1956, he spoke before the UN General Assembly, where he demanded some dates and timetables for Tanganyikan independence. The British threw him a bone and let him in the back door to fill a vacant seat in the Legislative Council. But it didn't take long for Nyerere to figure out he was spinning his wheels and that he wasn't even in the same bed as the British, let alone having completely different dreams. But elections did get held in 1958, and TANU candidates won all 30 seats, becoming the most important political force in Tanganyika. And this ultimately led, the next year, in 1959, to a vote to allow self-government for Tanganyika. And as the main force behind TANU, Julius Nyerere had been made chief minister in 1960. The U.S. State Department was hot to get to know this up-and-comer and invited him to visit. They were interested to perhaps see how he could fit into their Africa dream. He spent 5 weeks in the U.S. and went on a coast-to-coast schmooze fest, meeting government officials and many VIPs in the American Pan-African movement and other groups, getting the word out and spreading his message. And on December 9th, 1961, Tanganyika had its Independence Day. The new national flag was raised atop Mount Kilimanjaro and above the newly built National Stadium. And 5 days later, Tanganyika became the 104th member of the United Nations. 7 weeks later, Julius Nyerere resigned as prime minister after reality set in and all the rancid and unsightly aspects of the game of politics set in also. He stepped back and turned his attention to remaking TANU into something other than what it had become, giving it a new sense of purpose. And prior to resigning, he had arranged a $67 million loan from the World Bank. Now, of course, that's, chicken feed compared to the numbers in today's glittery BRI context. But Nyerere knew Tanganyika's problems were never going to be solved by NGOs, foreign aid, and development loans. The heavy lifting had to be done by the people themselves. The country was being held down by the same evil forces that held all developing countries back: poverty, ignorance, and disease. And Nyerere looked to the one thing that drew all the European colonialists to the African continent as Tanganyika's potential savior. And that was, of course, mineral extraction and using those underground riches to lift up the Tanganyikan economy. Tanganyika had all the good stuff back then: gold, diamonds, coal, uranium, nickel, and copper. Zanzibar had historically been the center of the East African slave trade. In modern history, at least, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to do that thing that Europeans tended to do back then: gain a beachhead and then force themselves on the local inhabitants. But they were rejected in 1698, and Zanzibar was taken over by the Sultanate of Oman, and a ruling Arab elite controlled Zanzibar economically and politically from there on out. But they, too, faced hard times when mid-19th century the slave trade became so odious that it was being abolished all over the world. And with the slave trade being to Zanzibar what oil is to Saudi Arabia, this hit them hard. By 1890, Zanzibar and the other main island of Pemba were protectorates of Great Britain. Who were they protecting? Well, the Sultan, that's who. He stayed in power, and other than the slave trade being abolished and strictly enforced, it was business as usual there as a trading entrepot. The Sultan remained in power even after the British terminated their protectorate in 1963, and to quickly fast forward, a constitutional monarchy that was established to rule Zanzibar didn't last long. On January 12, 1964, less than a month before the Fab Four played Ed Sullivan, the Zanzibar Revolution was carried out that ousted the minority Arab Sultanate and replaced it with an African-led socialist government. There was a little bit of bloodletting that followed in the wake of this revolution. 20,000, mostly Arab, but also Indian residents of Zanzibar were killed. The Bulsara family were among the many people who got caught up in the violence of the Zanzibar Revolution and had to flee the island. Mr. and Mrs. Bulsara and prodigal son, 18-year-old Farouk Bulsara, left Zanzibar and flew to their new home in Britain. And then, 22 years later, as the lead singer of Queen, Farouk Bulsara, better known as Freddie Mercury, played Wembley during the Magic Tour. In April of 1964, Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika. They joined the first three letters of their respective country's name, and that's how Tanzania came about. Tanganyika, Zanzibar. It was called the United Republic of Tanganyika and Zanzibar at first, but a consensus arose that thought it best just to call the place Tanzania. And you can be sure, over in Beijing and the friendly confines of the leadership compound in Zhongnanhai, Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, and the entire CCP leadership – were gazing intently at this situation in Africa. By this time in 1964, the whole Great Leap Forward debacle and the famine had already happened. Mao was laying low, taking his lumps, being treated like a dead ancestor, and jonesing to make a comeback. But no matter how tarnished his brand may have been, he was still Chairman Mao. Maybe not in the U.S. or other Western nations, but in the PRC, that still meant a lot. And Mao knew this, and harnessing the power of these masses of people who held him in such high esteem was going to be the cornerstone of his return to power. And right as this was all happening over in Africa, one by one, all these new nations were created. Kenya achieved independence in 1963, Malawi and Zambia in 1964, Gambia in 1965. And while Africa's leaders tried in vain to stabilize their new nations and crank up their economies, outside forces were still there, just as they had always been going back to Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese in 1498 to engage in their great game. And it was into this whole dynamic of the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and other smaller players all mucking about, that China also threw their hat into the African ring. Even after that drubbing he had to take for his Great Leap Forward, Mao, in the eyes of many leaders of new African nations and leaders of the liberation fronts, was like a rock star. Freddie Mercury, he had nothing on Chairman Mao. And Maoism was enthusiastically embraced by many of these African leaders, politicians, and revolutionaries. They also had to take stock of their own country's situation and look to other political and economic models to choose the best path forward. And Mao's particular siren song of anti-colonial, anti-West, self-reliance, and a bit of the old ultra-violence, if necessary, really resonated with many. From their perch in sub-Saharan Africa, what wasn't to like? And all these new African nations were the belles of the ball early on. No one courted them more aggressively than Mao. This went back to the April 1955 Bandung Conference and Zhou Enlai's 5 Principles for Peaceful Coexistence. You know, all the contentious issues today related to China's engagement in Africa and the West casting doubt on their intentions went back to the Bandung Conference. Same sniping, just different words. But Mao looked to Africa and knew a good thing when he saw it. And with his own country still in split pants and trying to make its way in the world, Mao needed friends, and these post-colonial nations were the lowest hanging fruits out there. China sunk a lot of money into their African adventure during the 1960s and 70s. And back then, China was a pauper compared to now. Just in the past 2 decades, China's invested more than $150 billion in African infrastructure and other big projects. But back in Mao's day, he had a little coin purse compared to what Xi Jinping has at his disposal today. But despite all that, they invested heavily in Africa. Let me quote from the great Julia Lovell's book on Maoism. She was quoting an internal PLA document that pretty much sums up how the party looked at all this. Quote, "Africa itself looks like the 7 warring states. It is a huge political exhibition where 100 flowers are truly blooming, waiting there for anyone to pick. Africa is now both the center of the anti-colonialist struggle and the center for East and West to fight for control of an intermediary zone. We must tell them, in order to help them, about the revolutionary experience of the communists in this generation. In Africa, we do no harm to anyone. We introduce no illusions, for all we say is true." End quote. And even though money was tight, just like the big, glitzy FOCAC events of our day, the Chinese of Mao's generation rolled out the vermilion carpet for their African comrades. High-profile meetings, banquets, photo ops with all the top first-generation CCP stars, Chairman Mao, Premier Zhou, Liu Shaoqi, Chen Yi, Ye Jianying, Deng Xiaoping. During the first half of 1960, more than 100 representatives from Africa had beaten a path to Mao's door, hoping some of that magic might rub off on them. It all began for East Africa with a man named Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu. He was the Secretary General of the Zanzibar Nationalist Party, and he got the ball rolling in 1959 with his first visit to the PRC. Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu initiated the relationship with China and made multiple trips there in 1963 and 1964, paving the way for the presidential visit of Julius Nyerere in 1965. Babu was a China friend and all that meant. He received the full treatment when he was there and took it all in. And everything he saw with his own eyes and all the lectures, he brought it back to Zanzibar and became Chairman Mao's one-man PR firm. And thanks to Babu's sincere and useful friendship, the Chinese government warmly welcomed students who came to China and got the same orientation to the Chinese way. And they went back to Zanzibar and talked their experience up and delivered glowing reports about China. And they advocated for looking to the PRC as Zanzibar's development model. And after the spring of 1964 and Zanzibar's union with Tanganyika and the beginning of Tanzania history, over on the East African mainland side, they got to hear all about how great China was too. In 1964, the so-called Zhou Enlai African Safari took place. That was what many people called it. Premier Zhou went on a 7-week, 10-nation tour of Africa, visiting all the independent countries between December 1963, right after the Kennedy assassination, and February 1964. This was the first time someone this high up in the PRC government had ever visited the African continent. It was a 50-person delegation, including Foreign Minister and PLA legend Chen Yi. During this trip, during the visit to Somalia, Zhou announced his 8 principles for aid to Africa. They were: China always bases itself on the principle of equality and mutual benefit in providing aid to other nations. China never attaches any conditions or asks for any privileges. China helps lighten the burden of recipient countries as much as possible. Help recipient countries to gradually achieve self-reliance and independent development, and strive to develop aid projects that require less investment but yield quicker results and provide the best quality equipment and materials of its own manufacture. And in providing technical assistance, China shall see to it that the personnel of the recipient country fully master such techniques. And last, the Chinese experts are not allowed to make any special demands or enjoy any special amenities. So everything we see today with respect to China's engagement with Africa all goes back to this Zhou Enlai trip of late 1963.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Because of the January 12, 1964 Zanzibar Revolution and later discord in the Tanzanian military, Zhou had to pass on his visit to Dar es Salaam. And a few months after he was back in Beijing, the PRC extended diplomatic ties to Tanzania on April 26, 1964. And in June 1964, Babu and Tanzania Vice President Kawawa went to Beijing and signed an agreement worth 320 million shillings worth of development aid. Today, the Tanzanian shilling is about 2,500 to the U.S. dollar. Not sure what it was back then. But things continued to warm up, and in October 1964, Tanzania opened an embassy in Beijing. And right about here is when Julius Nyerere really began to create some controversy in the West, especially among Anglo-American elites. Same old thing. He was trying not to get forced into declaring for any side in the African Great Game surreptitiously playing out all around him. 1965 was as polarized a world as it had ever been since World War II. And like 2024, not a peaceful time at all. The Vietnam War, the Indo-Pakistani War, Dominican War, and the ever-simmering Middle Eastern pot. Western nations saw how well Julius Nyerere was getting on with his new Chinese friends and kicking the tires of socialism. So Babu took care of all the necessary groundwork to prepare for Julius Nyerere's China visit in 1965. And once Julius Nyerere touched down in Beijing, there were plenty of photo op moments. He got to meet everyone and signed a 10-year friendship treaty with the PRC. And during this inaugural visit, Nyerere was swept off his feet by what he saw. It was a very, choreographed visit, but nothing new there. And after he had taken it all in, he was sold on the idea that this Maoist model of agrarian development and organization was the one that was right for Tanzania. It was anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, stressed self-reliance, austerity, and the dignity of peasant labor. For a poor developing country like Tanzania, this kind of model was more realistic than other development models. And for the next 10 years, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere held high China's banner in Africa. And in return, the PRC, again, not sitting on the kind of sovereign wealth that they have today, was very generous with Tanzania. At his meeting with Zhou, Liu Shaoqi, and Mao, Nyerere had his moment to present his big ask from China. This was a big one. It concerned a proposed project called the Tanzam Railway, Tanzania-Zambia Railway. October 24th, 1964, Zambia, formerly Northern Rhodesia, gained independence from Great Britain. Back then, Nyerere and Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda were in discussion about a rail line that could bypass the British-controlled line that went through Rhodesia and South Africa. If Zambia could ship its copper to the port of Dar es Salaam, well, they could bypass that odious former colonial option. January 1967, Kenneth Kaunda visited China and discussed the project further. And then later that year, in September, the three sides signed the agreement to build the railway, a 988 million RMB interest-free loan to be repaid between 1973 and 2013. Today, this line is known as the Tanzanian-Zambian Railway Authority, or Tanzara. It was originally a 1,860-kilometer railway, single track, and this project was the largest, most high-profile overseas aid project for China up to that time. It was comparable in profile and significance to the Kenyan standard gauge railway of our day. It was touted as the Great Uhuru or Freedom Railway when it was built between April 1970 and 1975 at a cost of $406 million. That's a little over $3 billion in today's much-inflated dollars. Building a railway is not usually such a big deal, but this one was when it was announced. China got to give the U.S. and USSR the middle finger where this project was concerned, and the same could be said of colonialism and neocolonialism. At this time, when the Tanzam Railway was announced, the Sino-Soviet split was on afterburner, and all Western development banks who had been approached all sat on their hands when the Tanzanian and Zambian finance ministers tried to drum up interest for this project. And, as can be often said today, there were less strings attached to the loans when dealing with China compared to what the IMF and World Bank were offering. Needless to say, there was a whole lot of scoffing going on in the West about the prospects of this railway and the mess that China was surely going to make of it. One of the better-known quotes from Julius Nyerere that still reverberates today concerned the provenance of the development aid and the financing for the Tanzam Railway, he said, quote, "All the money in the world is either red or blue. I do not have my own green money, so where can I get some from? I'm not taking a Cold War position. All I want is the money to build it." End quote. You'll hear variations of that sentiment in all corners of the world today. Nyerere was just looking out for Tanzania. He was very wary of falling in between these Cold War tectonic plates that, by their very nature, could inadvertently cause so much pain to his country. To build the Tanzam Railway, China was willing to show a level of generosity that astounded everyone. It sent shockwaves through the world of development aid, infrastructure financing, and construction. It cost Mao an arm and a leg, but the message it sent the West, who weren't showing the PRC any respect, was huge. This was China's biggest ever project of its kind in the Third World, and it broadcast a message to the newly independent countries of Africa trying to find their way in the cruel world, who their friend was. It's well documented that tens of thousands of Chinese workers, cadres, and experts who were sent to work on this project committed the same cultural faux pas as everyone else in our time. In the 1950s, when the Soviets had sent their experts to China, language and cultural differences created a lot of tension and misunderstandings. And now with PRC experts in Tanzania, even with all this mutual enthusiasm for their new ties, few among the masses on both sides had degrees in African or Chinese studies. So, like it is today, and probably forever, there were a lot of hard feelings bubbling beneath the surface. And while I was working on this episode, I got a notice from the USC China Institute about a postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Kun Huang, who had just given a talk about the subject of this railway as a Cold War-era symbol of China-Africa friendship. And she also explored the matters of race and how cross-cultural misunderstandings created a certain dynamic. I'm sorry I missed that one. Anyway, getting this railway built was a brave and Herculean effort with plenty of drama and tragic losses of life. But it got built, despite all the planning and engineering mistakes. Mao wasn't shy about telling Nyerere that he was tightening his own belt in China and forsaking development in his own country for the sake of socialist solidarity and their common struggle. And most of that was probably true. As far as Maoism and Mao Zedong thought, the chairman was, naturally a true believer, and he liked how no small number of Africans looked at him as some kind of deity whose ideology would liberate Africa. So between this and the aid that was coming in, it all gained the PRC some serious anti-colonial street cred with all the main beneficiaries of their efforts. 1960s, PRC started sending medical and agricultural outreach programs, similar to the Peace Corps, and they also supplied military training and aid to African liberation groups, including the ANC. PRC operatives worked closely with the anti-colonial freedom fighters, and the medical teams in particular were a walking, talking pro-CCP, pro-Mao, pro-PRC public relations machine. Mao was banking on all-out revolution in Africa. He looked at China's experiences and saw that the same rogues gallery of imperialists who pushed China around were now doing more or less the same with most of these African nations. In Mao's eyes, the ground didn't get any more fertile than Africa in the 1960s and 70s, and the common struggle against the Western imperialists was the atomic force that bound the African nations with the PRC. Mao dipped his toe in the water with early support he gave to the FLN, or National Liberation Front, who was giving La France a lot of grief in the Algerian War of Independence. Mao was going to play the long game here with respect to spreading Maoist internationalism and reaching out to all these newly independent African nations. Despite the dire needs of PRC citizens, Mao dedicated a lot of very limited resources to spreading his message and supporting all the liberation movements still fighting for independence. Mao's eyes were on the prize, He wanted the PRC to rightfully gain admittance to the UN, including the seat on the Security Council. One nation, one vote. Those newly independent nations, as they were admitted to the UN, one by one, slowly began to tilt the scales of membership in favor of the PRC. And if Eric and Cobus had their show back in the 1960s, well, they think the 2020s were a case of deja vu all over again. No one was using the term debt trap diplomacy yet, but all this early PRC assistance and engagement with Africa, it was scoffed at by the West, and China's intentions were always portrayed in a most nefarious light. Between the PRC and their Western detractors, the African people all got PhDs in propaganda and a free survey course in Rhetoric 101. African nations weren't being asked to take sides any more than they're being asked to take sides today. That is to say, the request to choose sides was implicit. Same back then as it is now, and the African reaction hasn't changed much since then either. Each nation, depending on their particular circumstances, only cared for what was best for them. Who was the geopolitical beneficiary? That wasn't a deciding factor. In that old book from 1968, Leaders of New Nations, there was a sentence that stuck out that kind of showed how the West, and certainly the U.S., viewed China's engagement with Africa. It went, quote, "Many communists from Zanzibar came to the mainland after the so-called Union, and perhaps paved the way for the heavy Chinese assistance program in Tanzania. This communist assistance to Tanzania has worried the neighboring states of Kenya and Uganda, who see it as a threat to East Africa." USA, USSR, the PRC, they were all looking for the same thing to varying degrees. As much as all three tended to play their African partners for fools sometimes, politicians in the African nations were wise to the whole dynamic of the 1960s and 70s and masterfully played the three main contenders off against each other. The Mao generation dealt in chump change compared to the PRC of the Xi Jinping era. But regardless of the size of Chinese largesse in Africa, Mao too had to deal with bad loans, debt refinancing, budget overruns on infrastructure projects, and always reacting to unexpected and unanticipated bumps in the road that ultimately meant delays in projects and more money needed. And like you'll hear today on the African side, they fumed occasionally about shoddy workmanship and being taken advantage of. The ROI was a mixed bag for China, depending on which African nation you wanted to zero in on. In the end, Mao didn't get what he really wanted. The people of the African countries by the 1970s, by and large, said, "Thanks for the aid and the spiritual support and providing the model to emulate." But when it came to the Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought part, they said, "Thanks, but no thanks." Well, May 25th, 1966, Nie Yuanzi pasted her Dazi Bao on the campus of Peking University, and that's often pointed to as the start of the Cultural Revolution. 1966 to 1968 were the main years, and in Tanzania, 1967, and elsewhere in Africa, they too got all caught up in the optimism and revolutionary fervor. And as I said, Nyerere saw merit in the Chinese model and believed, with modifications of course, that it could work in Tanzania's specific case. 1965, 66, 67 were the glory days of the relationship between Julius Nyerere and the first generation of CCP leaders. On February 5th, 1967, Nyerere announced the Arusha Declaration and its centerpiece policy of Ujamaa. It was TANU's signature program. Ujamaa was a Maoist social and economic revolution heavy on self-reliance. As Mao believed it would happen in China, Nyerere also believed that through collective hard work, the Tanzanian people were going to transform agricultural development and lift up the nation's fortunes and the people along with it. The excitement of Mao thought and all the slogans and meanings behind the Cultural Revolution spilled over into Tanzania. Mao badges were worn. Many of the symbols of the Cultural Revolution were all enthusiastically embraced by many in Tanzania. The Little Red Book, in English and Swahili, was everywhere. And just like Mao had Red Guards, Nyerere also had his own youths who acted as coercers and enforcers of Tanu party rules. He even sported Mao suits at official events. Tanzanian government officials were made to live like Cato, austere, frugal, no conspicuous wealth. Nyerere demanded that they had to set an example. He went all out as far as embracing these Maoist policies. And for this, he was just castigated by Western reporters and government spokespersons. The bookstores in Dar es Salaam were flooded with Chinese titles in English, translated into Swahili and other languages. Radio programs from China were also quite popular. Maoism was having its moment in Tanzania. Their neighbor to the northeast, Kenya, was making a lot of noise about this conspicuous Chinese presence there, and what were they up to with respect to all this transfer of Maoist ideology. In for a penny, in for a pound. Nyerere went ahead and did the ultimate. He nationalized all the banks, industries, and mining of minerals and metals. Nyerere shared Mao's passion for the mass line. He, too, tried to whip up the enthusiasm of the masses of peasants and get them on board with this Ujamaa program. He wasn't calling it a great leap forward or anything, but I'm sure a lot of what Nyerere was advocating for has a familiar ring to it. When he first went to China in 1965, the worst of the Great Leap had already been cleaned up. Had he come in 1960 and toured the countryside of Henan province, he might have had second thoughts about the policies he force-fed his nation. For now, the golden time of Sino-Tanzanian relations was running at full throttle and would last into the 1970s. One factor that slowed the wheels of progress was a lack of Tanzanians who could speak Mandarin and an equal lack of Chinese who had a true working proficiency in Swahili. English only worked sometimes. Into 1968, with Ujamaa in full swing, some people were wondering if Tanzania was going through its own version of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Nyerere paid another visit to the PRC in that year and was, of course, very warmly received. Nyerere ended up having a similar problem as Mao. It was a cinch to whip the students and disaffected youth up into a frenzy and get their hopes ratcheted up and allow them to blow off some steam. Well, it wasn't so easy to cool these nuclear fuel rods down once they got ignited. In 1969, the Chinese opened their embassy in Dar es Salaam. By the following year, they had become the largest supplier of military assistance to Tanzania, pushing Canada down into second place. In 1971, 6 African nations changed their recognition from the ROC to the PRC. That year served as the tipping point. The PRC government now had the necessary 2/3 majority. October 25th, 1971, 26th session of the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 2758 to restore China's seat at the UN to the PRC. And China received 76 of 111 votes, and 26 of those votes came from African countries. Mao's investment, going back to the early 60s, paid off in the end. Mao and the surviving leadership of the party, what was left of them in the waning years of the Cultural Revolution, they knew they wouldn't have been able to have their historic moment at the UN without the support and votes of their hard-won friends and allies on the African continent. Between 1973 and 75, Operation Vijiji was carried out. This carried a faint scent of Mao's failed policies of collectivization in agriculture back in the 1950s. Nyerere's new policy of forced villagization declared that anyone who hadn't volunteered to be sent down to the countryside back in 1967 were now left with no choice. Youths were sent down to the villages, just like Mao had done in China starting in December 1968. On his 4th visit to the PRC in 1974, Nyerere had said, quote, "Two things convince me, that socialism can be built in Africa and that it is not a utopian vision. For capitalism is ultimately incompatible with the real independence of African states. The second thing is, China is providing encouragement and an inspiration for younger and smaller nations which seek to build socialist societies." End quote. In total, Julius Nyerere visited China 13 times. The first passenger train of the Tanzam Railway arrived in Dar es Salaam October 1st, 1975. By then, Ujamaa was finished and only lip service was being paid to the ideals it represented. Though nowhere near the catastrophe that China faced in 1959-1960, Ujamaa policies led to famine and increased poverty. By 1983, the Tanzam Railway authorities had to cry out for help. The railway never was able to meet its target operational capacity. Politics and Cold War antics pushed a lot of freight traffic to competing transport lines. By the 1990s, the fortunes of this once heralded project that showcased PRC-Africa friendship and cooperation began to slide quickly. By the 2000s, the railway was, for all intents and purposes, in disrepair. But a showcase project such as this, that had such profound significance back in the Mao era, was kept alive, mostly with Chinese money. And into our day, what to do about Tanzara is still hotly debated. There are packages for tourists to ride this railway where they can take in some pretty incredible scenery and wildlife, but that wasn't what Tanzam was built for. But just before I posted this episode to the CHP feed, there's been a little bit of excitement with respect to this historic railway. Back in December 2023, Chinese, Tanzanian, and Zambian officials began discussing a possible billion-dollar injection by the China Development Bank to breathe new life into Tazara. And this came in response to some talk going on about another railway link under discussion with an American-led consortium. The competition never ends. Well, as long as the Africans make out all right, it's really what's most important in the end. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere served 5 terms as president between 1960 and 1985. He was described as modest and incorruptible, a sharp contrast to past African leaders. He's considered the father of the country, but also had to own up to trampling on human rights, wrecking the economy, and all the negative fallout from Ujamaa. Julius Nyerere's embrace of certain aspects of Maoism and applying them to Tanzania didn't work. Parts of the Tanzanian economy got ravaged by the plunge in agricultural productivity, followed by the inevitable droughts and famines. Ujamaa really damaged Nyerere's legacy. Most of the policies were all undone in the years following his retirement. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere died on October 14, 1999, of leukemia. The 1990s was a period when China heralded its return to Africa. This time around, they left all the Maoist slogans and emphasis on Maoism and revolution behind and focused more on what was more pressing to the Tanzanian people. Investment poured in and factories were built that employed great numbers of workers. And just as world importers looked to China as a source of cheap labor to produce low-priced consumer goods, the same went with how Chinese manufacturers and mining companies viewed the African labor market. And this exposed China to a lot of pushback, and the same old misunderstandings of the 1960s were being made again in the 90s. There's no formal treaty that binds Tanzania and the PRC, but over the years, through all the twists and turns of history, they built this relationship with its shared past history that binds them in a certain way. For some, there may even be a little bit of nostalgia for the Mao era. Last year, China's first political school opened in Africa, the first one of its kind, established by China's Communist Party. This was in February 2022. It's called the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Leadership School. The organization behind the school is China's Central Party School, the Zhongyang Dangxiao. They arranged for the $40 million grant to build and operate the school and are instrumental in the ideological training that's offered there. The school is located in Kibaha, Tanzania, an hour west of Dar es Salaam. Students receive lectures and are taught the party line, the CCP way. The students learn all the basics, leadership, recruitment, propaganda, organization, administration, mass mobilization, party discipline, anti-corruption, and party governance. The school was established in cooperation with the 6 ruling liberation movements, the 6 FLMSA, the former liberation movements of Southern Africa: Tanzania, Mozambique, Namibia, Angola, South Africa, and Zambia. And anyone interested to learn more about the nation of Tanzania or about East Africa or Africa in general, no, it's not like it used to be. There are a cornucopia of available resources out there on platforms all over the world where you could learn and explore to your heart's content. And if China's engagement in Africa and the global South interests you in any way, once again, Eric, Cobus, Giraud, the China Global South podcast. I'm a paid subscriber to their newsletter, and this allows me to keep my finger on that China-Africa pulse. Okay, until the next time, mes beaux amis, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. My eternal thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you'll come back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.